Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. So as Jeffrey said, I'm the Whitehall and defense editor for the Sunday Express, which, for those that might not know, is a right-of-center, mid-market newspaper. Essentially, that means that I'm not an expert. It means that I listen to people like this and share their views to our million or so readers. But I'll try to have a few thoughts of my own today. So we're here to discuss security threats to the West, and of course, the atrocities carried out a week ago are a good starting point. Sadly, as anyone with intelligence, with access to intelligence sources will know, we're all living on a powder keg. British security services have foiled at least 7 terror plots over the last 12 months and are making an average of 1 arrest every day. French security services have been on alert for another attack since Charlie Hebdo. Currently, ISIS represents the most significant threat to innocent citizens. Its territorial land grab has been its biggest recruiting poster, and it has used this, not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars plundered from Iraqi banks, to attract very sophisticated minds. It sends around 250,000 tweets a month from some 43,000 separate Twitter accounts. Most don't speak of war. They speak of the caliphate and why Europeans should abandon their homes, their families, and their upbringing to join them. We've learned this week how postgraduates man a so-called jihadi help desk, on call 24 hours a day to help radicals make the most of the dark web. It's certainly understandable that all our attention is being focused to ridding the world of this evil death cult. In Britain, the overwhelming feeling among senior generals and most of the public at the moment is that the time has come to take the fight across to the Syrian border, with some even advocating the use of ground troops in a good old-fashioned 19th century type campaign as the only solution. I've entertained this thought too, extending a tactical operation to focus on Raqqa, for instance, without the problematic issue of regime change is tempting. After all, even senior Israeli generals attest to the fact that the devil they know can be handled. And what would we really lose by allowing Russia to have a free hand in Syria? After all, Syria hasn't been a friend to the West for many, many years. But I've thought about this, and it seems to me that whilst cutting off the snake's head, to use David Cameron's rhetoric, is tempting, it's only tempting until you realize that you're in a snake farm. And while Assad remains in power, the struggle between Shia and Sunni, as we've heard very well this morning, will continue, and conditions will remain for it to rise again. Since this conference has been organized by the ECR, I'd like to speak for a moment about France's response to Friday's attacks. There's been a lot of speculation here about his decision to invoke the Solidarity Clause of the Lisbon Treaty. There have been questions asked, is this a springboard to greater European defense? Already, as we all know, we have EU embassies around the world bristling with military attaches, an important symbolic indication of EU aspirations. And what will it mean for NATO? But in my view, the truth is actually quite the opposite. Hollande's instinctive response to last week's attacks was to call for a coalition of the willing. Like the US, France has always enjoyed the freedom of unilateral action. He was, in fact, persuaded to invoke Article 42.7. But what's fundamental is that he did not call upon the EU's common policy on security and defense. Why is this? Because he needs action, tangible assistance. The CPSD has let France down in Mali and in the Central African Republic. And as French Minister Le Drian made quite clear, this is about member states stepping up and doing their bit. France has more than 7,000 troops in foreign theaters, and as we all know, the idea is that member states will help take up its slack, the slack in its commitments. So Germany is already in the process of agreeing to free up its commitments in Mali, and I do wonder whether the news we heard this morning is actually an attempt to persuade France that it can't afford to divert its troops from Mali. I don't know. In any case, this is no time for opportunistic EU flag-wheeling. I mean, it's significant that France had never any intention of leaving the US out of the loop, and it was rewarded. Washington is now sharing Five Eyes intelligence with Paris, deferring upon it for the first time a status hitherto reserved for special allies, such as Britain. President Hollande was persuaded to invoke 42.7 because he saw an opportunity for Europe to finally get to grips with intelligence sharing. This chimes in perfectly with what NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg told the EDA this week when he said NATO should be working hand in hand rather than side by side with Europe. Working hand in hand is fine. That's about mutual cooperation. It's about shoring up weaknesses. What it is not is about duplication. And there were other reasons too. Hollande realized he would have to break mandated defense spending limits to exceed the 3% of GDP. In addition, he realized they would have to assume greater controls over French borders. Now, this is the fourth attack on this ever-discredited notion of open borders in the last 6 months, even though he has now declared that he will not try to stop Schengen. It's worth remembering here that our geographic borders assist Britain greatly in securing our defense. As Anthony said, it's not really about smuggling of people, it's about the smuggling in of weapons. The intelligence sources and military sources I've spoken to insist to this day that we have been greatly helped by our geographic borders. But we cannot doubt that the institutions will be champing at the bit for greater relevance. The truth, though, is that 42.7 was invoked not to bolster the CDSP, but rather to break through Brussels' bureaucratic hamstrings. And let's not forget that even though France is not going through NATO, this type of coalition can only exist because it is benefiting from an established NATO relationship and the interoperability that that already involves. But certainly Islamic jihadism is more than just ISIS. Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, for instance, are both thriving. I reported in March, after spending time in Lampedusa, that the chances of a lone wolf jihadi gaining access to the continent through Italy, where they don't even have the power to force refugees to give their fingerprints, was quite high. Elsewhere, relations with China and the US are at their lowest point for years, with increasing friction over a growing list of issues, including cyber espionage, currency manipulation, human rights, and territorial claims in the South China Sea. Since we're gathered just a stone's throw from the heart of British government, I think we should take a moment to address Britain's own defence position. Much was made of the government's pledge to honour NATO's 2% of GDP commitment last year. Sadly, as Lord Robertson pointed out to me, it's the stuff of smoke and mirrors, since we are now including operation costs, something that was not allowed when he was Secretary General. The £2 billion pledge made this week to our counter-terror operations is not new money, despite reports to the contrary. Crucially, however, George Osborne is alive to another type of threat, cyber attack. Earlier this week, during an unprecedented speech at GCHQ, he confirmed that while ISIS does not yet have the ability to do more than hack into websites for propaganda purposes, as we saw with its taking over of France's TV5 website, it is aspiring to use cyber attacks to bring down key infrastructure. Britain's solution apparently will be to launch cyber attacks against ISIL. On Monday, as we've heard, the government will announce its decision about future defense spending. Already we know a couple of things. Despite having the smallest Royal Navy in modern times, there are plans to harbour one of our new Type 45 destroyers and an older Type 23 for training purposes. It doesn't mean they won't be operational, but what it does mean is they won't be operational as much as they could be. Crucially, it's yet to be seen whether the Chancellor has allowed the Prime Minister to heed the advice of General Nick Carter that we must invest in a new main battle tank. Our Challenger 2s are old and frail, and as our Polish colleagues no doubt will confirm, constantly breaking down. But this leads us neatly on to Russia. Putin's newfound confidence was marked by his first appearance at the UN General Assembly for 10 years. Suddenly, he is being pictured with Obama at the G20 in Turkey. Suddenly, he is a man whose opinion is courted. It's understandable that France has taken his extended hand to fight against ISIS. But I'm afraid my alarm signals are sounding loud and strong. Syria is a win-win scenario for Russia. By pounding ISIS, it's simply helping to prop up Assad's regime. At the same time, it's allowing him to show that he's avenging the murder of the 224 Metrojet passengers. He's unimpeded by international convention. His offensive in Syria has demonstrated a powerful leader who can deliver. Contrast this to the vacillations of NATO. Canada is out, France is stalled, Britain is stalled temporarily, and France has just begun. Some say we can work with Putin, fill in the holes in his counter-terrorist intelligence gathering in return for a word in Assad's ear about barrel bombing of civilians. I'm afraid that's misguided. Putin does not have Assad's favorite ear. That position is held by Tehran. If there's any doubt that even if he has promises, he would never be able to deliver them. And throughout all this, nothing is being done to prevent him from carrying on his Cold War mentality. Russia is always putting forward the analogy of Allied cooperation in World War II. It's a useful analogy, but it's wrong. Let's not forget, Stalin was a monster too. And just because he occupied millions of people, and Putin still inhabits the same Soviet world. So we should be pragmatic by all means, but let's not kid ourselves. All we've done is let the fox into the hen house.